Welcome to Reimagining Soviet Georgia. My name is Brian Gigantino. During the Russian Civil War between May 1918 and February 1921, the Democratic Republic of Georgia, known as the First Republic, was a nominally independent state controlled by Social Democrats. These Georgian Social Democrats were Mensheviks. Formally, Menshevism and Bolshevism were two distinct wings of the empire-wide Russian Social Democratic Labor Party. In the decades leading up to 1918, Menshevism and Bolshevism in Georgia had more politically in common than not. However, over time, strategic and political differences set them apart. Georgian Menshevism, led by Noe Zhordania and others, blended a particular vision of Georgian nationhood and national liberation with their Marxist politics. But in 1921, as Bolsheviks began consolidating power around Georgia, the Red Army invaded with the help of local Georgian Bolsheviks, and the First Republic was no more. In Georgia today, the First Republic exists as an important reference point of Georgian independence and sovereignty, and the only example of modern Georgian nationhood. However, the Marxist politics of its founders and the intimate political upbringing they shared with Bolsheviks in Georgia is often ignored or disregarded. So what does the First Republic really mean for Georgia today? To explore this and more, Sopo Japaridze and I welcome Stephen Jones as our guest. Stephen Jones is a historian and political scientist and a self-described socialist who has been studying and writing on Georgia since the 1970s. He is an expert on Georgia's First Republic, authoring the now classic 2005 study on the topic, Socialism in Georgian Colors, The European Road to Social Democracy, as well as an excellent study on post-Soviet Georgia, Georgia, a political history since independence. Stephen, tell us a little bit about your first time visiting Georgia in the Soviet period.
So, while I was doing my master's degree at the University of London, I became interested in the question of non-Russian peoples in the Soviet Union. At this time, there was very, very little research on the non-Russian peoples. Most of the focused research, because people were interested in getting jobs, was on things like criminology and arms control, these sorts of things. When I first decided to look at the Georgian case, my supervisor told me, don't do it. You won't get a job. Of course, he couldn't anticipate the fact that in the 1980s, along comes Mikhail Gorbachev, and the national issue suddenly becomes an explosive issue, and I became very busy. But I first went to Georgia in 1978, and this was, of course, late Brezhnevism in the Soviet Union. I was very surprised in many ways to find the sort of Soviet Georgia I did find, which was, it was clearly fin de siècle. Everything was sort of crumbling and coming to an end. And it was a very sort of lavish lifestyle for many of the Georgians that I mixed with at this time. Young Georgians who really weren't concerned about getting a job, for example, because education was free. So I would meet Georgians with multiple degrees, and I would meet, I'd meet Georgians, multiple architects, for example, who couldn't find work at that time, but they could, they could continue studying. So there were, it was a really quite extraordinary place for me at this time. Coming from London, a struggling student. And finding that actually many, let's say, middle-class Georgians at this time were living far better than I was in London. So it was a very interesting place to be at this time. It was like observing, the crumbling of the empire from within.
And were you able to go anywhere else in the Soviet Union at this time? And how was Soviet Georgia maybe in comparison?
Yeah, I had visited other parts of the Soviet Union, and in particular, of course, Russia. I'd been to the Kuban. I'd spent some time in Leningrad and Moscow. So there were points of comparison. I've been to Ukraine as well. Um, well, Georgia, as always, was a little different from the other places I visited in the Soviet Union. And, we could go into a long conversation about why it was different. Um, it, 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 it was, of course, under Moscow's control, but it had many more opportunities to do its own thing, let's say. Um, this was a problem in the Russian Empire too. Um, the further you were away from Moscow, the more flexibility you had in some sense. Um, in the Russian Empire, Georgia was highly under-policed. It was a place where the Russian Empire was poorly represented, actually, in terms of the numbers of officials and policemen. Although there was a big, the army was, of course, dominant in Transcaucasia at that time. Um, Georgia, yeah, it was very interesting. One of the things that made it different, of course, was the fact that it had more access, I suspect, to Western influences at that time because of the ports of Batumi and Poti, and that, of course, increased the potential for the black market in Georgia, and the black market also sort of just opened up other things that you could do that possibly was not possible in other parts of the Soviet Union at this time. So, for example, I met my wife Marina, at that time not my wife in 1978. Her father was a civil engineer. He had a chauffeur. I was driven around in this chauffeured car by a Soviet official. And we went to illegal bookshops to get illegal literature. Um, it was fascinating. It was just this. It was an otherworldly place.
The Soviet state was chauffeuring you around to illegal bookstores.
That's exactly right. Yeah, this was the sort of. It was a very strange place. And what was interesting for me, I was at that time, and I still am a committed socialist. And here I was in the Soviet state, the socialist state, where the bourgeoisie was plain and present. And obviously I'm not talking in Marxist terms, but there was a strong, privileged middle class, and they could do things. I mean, for example, watching movies that were you couldn't watch anywhere else. Um, that was accessible to the Georgian elite, and I'm sure it was accessible to elites elsewhere in the Soviet Union. But it was a very strange hybridic world where, on the one hand, there were these controls, but on the other hand, there were multiple ways of getting around them.
Actually, it's interesting you mentioning that there's this kind of Georgian Soviet elite at the time. And, I've also read about these ruble millionaires in Abkhazia or other places who were able to sort of, through corruption, basically accumulate small amounts or large amounts of capital at the time when such a thing was not legal. And I'm curious, just from again your own observations of being there, plus what you know, did you observe any kind of social or class tensions between elites and lower classes that were living in Soviet Georgia at the time? And if you did, how did it manifest?
Well, there were tensions in the sense that there were I'm not sure you'd call them labor strikes, but there was certainly labor dissent. But it was almost invisible. there was this enormous chasm between the local Georgian elites and the workers living in Didube and Avchala and other places, that it was neither the twixt would, there was no meeting at some level between these two societies, right? Um, there was also a sense that life was, the basic needs and were being met by this system. And of course, officially at least, the working class and the peasantry were given sort of rhetorical support as the leading social groups in Soviet society. They were seen as the sort of the salt of the earth that sustained the Soviet system in some sense. But by then, of course, this wasn't the reality at all. Yeah, you would meet lots of people. I would meet lots of people in 1978, 79 through to early 80s, in the circles that I mixed in at that time, who'd never traveled on public transport. It was already apparent, this privileged elite. It continued right into the 1970s, early 80s.
Yeah, and to what degree were there continuities between pre-Soviet and Soviet sort of elites in Georgia? And to what degree did the Soviet Union disrupt or sort of re-alter them from these, pre-Soviet imperial, especially local aristocratic kind of forms in Georgia?
Well, the real, the transformation came in 1917, 1918, right? Because Georgia separated itself from the new Russian Soviet state, or actually separated itself from the Tsarist state, and was independent, as we know, between 1918 and 1921, and began, let's say, a transformation of Georgian society. Politics completely changed. So one example simply would be the introduction of free elections in Georgia in February 1919 for the Constituent Assembly. The removal, for example, of all property qualifications for voting, which was the tradition under Tsarism, and giving women the vote, for example. The transformation at least began in 1917 through 1918. So I don't think, the Soviet Union, when it occupied independent Georgia in February of 1921, the Soviet system in the 1920s shared certain roots with Georgian Social Democrats, who led the First Republic between 1918 and 21. They were originally, all of them were Marxists. And they all actually were in the same party, the Russian Social Democratic Labour Party. So there were quite a few common roots. They knew each other. They had shared exile, shared many of the same ideas. But it must be said that the Georgian Social Democrats, particularly after 1905, really began to develop in a different direction from the mainstream Russian Social Democrats, in particular the Bolsheviks, but also the Russian Mensheviks. Georgians did go in a separate direction in many ways, different policies. By 1917, 1918, the Georgian Social Democrats were considered to be the enemy by the Bolsheviks, right? And vice versa. So the polarization, if you like, between these original comrades who shared Marxism really was very wide indeed by 1918. So when the Bolsheviks came in 1921, it was really, they brought in some very different ideas about how to construct society. There were continuities, but there were also major differences.
What are some of the major differences? And what are some of the continuities?
So, for example, the Georgian Social Democrats considered, think of the title of the state. It was called the Democratic Republic of Georgia, right? Uh, and there was a reason the word democratic was in there. Um, this was Noe Zhordania, who was chairman of the government of Georgia. This was very much central to his understanding of what the revolution meant and how the state should be constructed. So it wasn't just a Georgian republic, he said. It was a Georgian democratic republic. And what that meant, very interestingly, was something that went beyond traditional bourgeois republics in Europe, in his view. So it wasn't just about creating a legislature based on free election. It was also about creating popular power. So there would be the creation of eroba, or local governments, institutions of self-government, elections of judges, elections of government officials, referenda, so that the popular voice could be expressed, as well as the legislative voice, right? The legislature's voice. So he had a very specific idea as to what he wanted to see. It was, in that sense, at least, the aspiration was for what we might call a deliberative democracy today, right? Um, One in which there is minimal separation between the governors in the legislature and the governed. Um, the governed would have far more participation in their in governing themselves. So that was his idea, and that's why the word democratic was in the title. Um, and the other part of it was that Georgian Social Democrats understood, because of the geopolitical situation, that they had to make some compromises, and they had fused into the revolutionary idea, the idea of national cultural development. Um, so the Georgian social democratic version of socialism was fused with the idea of national liberation. And there are lots of arguments about this. You can see it in the writings of Noe Zhordania, Kaki Chrenkeli, who was for a while the foreign minister in the First Republic. You can see this very innovative attempt to combine the ideas of socialism and internationalism with the ideas of national independence and national cultural development for Georgians. Um, so, and at the same time, they believed that they were not creating a proletarian dictatorship. They were creating a social democratic state. That was their goal. Ultimately, yes, socialism, internationalism, and so on. But they had a very specific goal, to create sovereignty for a small nation, namely Georgia. Right. When the Bolsheviks came in, of course, they had very different ideas about that. Proletarian internationalism, um, the importance of large states rather than small states, right? Um, um, Centralization, in particular when it came to the Communist Party. Um, so it was a very different approach to the construction of a state, and I say that. Although in the 1920s, of course, there was this policy of what we know as korenizatsiya, or indigenization, the idea that the republics in the Soviet Union should be given the opportunity to develop their cultures, their national cultures, right? But this was a policy that barely lasted a decade. before Stalin really began to impose an authoritarian and highly centralized view of the Soviet state. Um, um, but there was an attempt in the 1920s, and you got some very interesting Georgian Bolsheviks, people like Budum Divani, even Pilipe Maharadze, who believed that and even campaigned for Georgia, for example, having its own foreign ministry, um, Georgia having its own currency, Georgia being able to negotiate with other sovereign states on questions of trade. These sorts of things were promoted early on by Georgian Bolsheviks, right? Um, but there was a lot of resistance at the center to this. Lenin actually supported some of these ideas, and it was this issue in particular that led to the break between Lenin and Stalin before Lenin finally, in 1923 had his stroke, and the final stroke that really incapacitated him. But one of the last letters he wrote was in support of what were known pejoratively as the national deviationists. And the Georgian Bolsheviks were an outstanding example, if you like, of these national deviationists who were trying to create more powers for the republics, a more genuine federalism, right? But then you had other Bolsheviks who were very powerful, like Sergei Orjonikidze, who were working against these ideas and wanted to create a Soviet Transcaucasian Federation, which they did. And greater centralization in Moscow with control of party life in a very sort of hierarchical way. And so there was a battle, and unfortunately, the Georgian Bolsheviks, who wanted more independence for Georgia, lost that battle. Gradually through the 1920s, the freedoms that had been maintained, including, for example, the freedom to write about the revolution in an honest way, they were removed. One of the very serious incidents, of course, was the 1924 revolt against Bolshevik power led by Georgian Social Democrats, which also was a turning point that made Georgian Bolsheviks realize that they were only going to give very limited toleration to any opposition.
I think I've heard you say this before, but mostly like the Bolsheviks in taking power in 1917 and Mensheviks, say, in Georgia, but they pretty much were doing the same things, right? As far as like dealing with sort of a crumbled, inheriting and crumbling, well, in the Russia sense, empire, Georgia sense, like a colony, and so I think I've heard you say they had similar responses how to deal with building, right, rebuilding economy, rebuilding the whole society.
You mean between the Georgian Social Democrats and the Bolsheviks?
Yeah, not between the Georgian version, but parallel timeline. So people are in Moscow and St. Petersburg doing the same thing that people are doing in Tbilisi, right? Everyone's sort of responding in a similar way as far as similar policies.
Yeah, I mean, think about the 1920s as a really quite exciting period in which there was a lot of debate about the future of the Soviet state. There was room for opposition and dissent. There were different prognoses, right, about the future of socialism in Soviet Russia. This was the time, of course, that Lenin realized that war communism was a temporary phenomenon and was actually disastrous for the economy, and switched to the new economic policy, NEP, which was accompanied by some cultural and political loosening. But although this was going on, there were very interesting debates within the Bolshevik Party at this time, particularly in the first half of the 1920s. You must remember at the same time that the Bolsheviks felt they were under siege, and they had inherited this very centralized vision of the party. You might remember that in 1921 they passed a resolution that effectively tried to ban opposition in the party, right? So that tendency was also there. And so, for example, the Mensheviks, the Russian Mensheviks, very soon were put on trial and expelled. So alternatives to Bolshevism, even on the left, were quickly suppressed. So again, it's you see points of hope, maybe, in the sense that there were these debates going on in the party, and there were alternatives that were presented. There was the workers' opposition, for example, within the Communist Party. But unfortunately, after the death of Lenin in 1924, and the rise of Stalin, and the way that he manipulated alliances with Kamenev and Zinoviev and others, and the marginalization of Trotsky and so on. By the second half of the 1920s, I think it was clear that the Soviet Union was going in a more authoritarian direction, and of course, with collectivization at the end of the 1920s, that direction was clear, and opposition was no longer tolerated, and all the republics, the one thing that the republics had that had helped them, I think, to sort of resist some of these more sort of centripetal forces that were coming from Moscow, was the national question, because of this policy of Koreanization or indigenization. There were possibilities of a greater cultural freedom that was reflected perhaps in more literary freedom, for writers and poets and such. In Georgia, of course, it was the Blue Horns, who were the most famous of these poetic groups that continued to pursue not so much a Georgian national tradition of poetry, but experimental, let's say.
But there was also, as I recall, like in what used to be Communard Park, Alexandrov's park, that there was Bolshevik soldiers that gathered, and I believe that they were shot by Mensheviks, weren't they, 1917?
Yeah, so if we're going to go back to the First Republic, right, then it's a very complicated time. Obviously, it's a time in which there was it was a major political division between the Georgian Social Democrats on the one hand and the Bolsheviks on the other, right? And the Bolsheviks were seen as a threat to Georgian social democracy, and eventually also to the sovereignty of the Georgian First Republic. And there's no doubt in my mind that they were a threat. And of course, eventually the Georgian Bolsheviks fulfilled their threat by invading Georgia in February of 1921. So, going back to this incident in the Alexandra Gardens, which was opposite, the Viceroy's Palace on Golovinsky Avenue, it was known then. It was an example of, it was a very different time. These were extraordinary times. These were revolutionary times. These were times when ordinary laws and principles were abandoned.
But I think in general, it was pre-revolution. It was very violent from all sides. Violence was sort of part of this like larger eh, period. As what I've read from Sunni's book, Eric von Rey, is that violence was something very accepted. Like wasn't as like the way we react now to violence.
Well, I think, that Tsarism embodied that sort of violence, of course, because there was very little opportunity for any sort of political participation, and Tsarism, particularly after the concessions it made in 1905, after the 1905 revolution, you had this period of reaction, let's say, under Nicholas II, where the Georgian Social Democratic Party, well, it wasn't a separate party at that time, it was still part of the Russian Social Democratic Labour Party, but it was decimated. It was decimated by arrests and exiles, and in some cases executions. Yeah, absolutely violence. But if you talk about 1917, when the events in the Alexandra Gardens happened, you've got to remember that revolutions, however we define them, they are extraordinary events when all the rules and values and norms that you normally follow go out of the window. And one thing we often associate with revolution, but is not necessarily true in every case, is violence. I can think of revolutions. We might even talk about the Rose Revolution as a non-violent revolution. We might talk about Gandhi's revolution, if you like, if we can call it that, against the British after World War II, as a non-violent resistance movement that overthrew imperial rule. So violence doesn't always necessarily. It's not always necessarily a part of revolution, but in this case, in 1917, yes, and everything was, of course, accelerated as well. Revolutions very often concentrate, big events and major shifts in a very short period of time, and this was what was happening also in 1917 through to 1921. But let me just say this about that Alexandra Gardens event, that it was actually one of the first events that was violent, that between the Bolsheviks and the Mensheviks, the Social Democrats, Georgian Social Democrats, because there was a yearning among Georgian Bolsheviks and Social Democrats. Some people call them Mensheviks, although I do not. There was a yearning for unity. A lot of the Bolsheviks did not want to separate out from the mainstream Georgian Social Democrats at this time. But there was an understanding in Moscow. Lenin, when he arrived, came out with the April Theses in I think it was in April 1917. The idea that we don't join a bourgeois government. We're going to create a proletarian government, and also we're going to split with the Mensheviks. So, and there was some resistance to that among Georgian Bolsheviks.
I think everyone was against it at first. I think only Lenin was for it at one point.
Yeah, well, Lenin, he pushed it through, and eventually the Georgian Bolsheviks, because they were disciplined followers of Bolshevik rules of democratic centralism. They abided by what was coming down from the Central Committee, which was split with the Georgian Social Democrats, which by let's say the summer of 1917 they had, and this is when you really begin to get this fierce battle of survival between Georgian Bolsheviks and Georgian Social Democrats, because they had such different goals and visions by this time.
I've noticed a lot of people will use the First Republic as a counterpose, against the Soviet Union. but like without the socialist ideas. Like, so they'll be like, they pretty much hate everything socialism, and any kind of politics that's not right wing or liberal, very liberal in a right wing liberal sense. And so they hate everything related to socialism, yet they will pretend that they are for the First Republic and counterpose that. So I feel like they do it in like bad faith, right? They have like, they don't really care about the First Republic. They don't really care about Soviet Union. They really just right wing, and they're just trying to find any way they can sort of disagree with Soviet Union. So what do you think gets lost in the discussions around First Republic? Why is it that lots of right wingers use their First Republic often to try to destroy social politics, like socialism or welfare, and like any kind of basic welfare politics generally?
In contemporary Georgia.
In contemporary Georgia,
Georgia.
The narrative, the current narrative, at least that's focused on the First Republic, right, is based on this idea of national liberation, right, of independence, and certainly, the Georgian Democratic Republic, should be celebrated for its attempt to create a sovereign state. I mean, that's one part of it. The other part of it that is often ignored, however, the narrative that is ignored, is the fact that they were trying to create a social democratic state, and that meant definitely support of what we would call today, I guess, welfare programs. Support in terms of unemployment insurance for workers. The Georgian workers would share in the running of the factories at some level, or at least they had some control over dismissals of workers by employers. The idea of self-government in the provinces and regions, through the Erobar was really, in my view, yes, okay, it's a democratic idea, but I think it went, as Zhordania was saying, further than the sort of normal understanding of a republic to the idea of popular power. So that part of the experience of the First Republic, most Georgians know nothing about. It's unfortunate that when the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, we did. This was a time of what we call neoliberalism, right? A time when both the IMF and the World Bank and the United States and the European Union wasn't around then, but other countries in Europe were pushing this idea of the displacement of the state and its replacement by a free market, a privatization, these sorts of things. What we might call, a free market vision, if you like, of the economy, and also related to that, of course, the reduction in the powers of the state and its support of greater equality or whatever it might be. That all went by the board, right? It went out of the window. And it was within that context that anything that was vaguely associated with socialism became extraordinarily negative. It starts, of course, with Gamsa-Khudir. It continues through even Shevardnadze, and then, of course, reaches its apogee, we could say, under Saakashvili. And it's a very one-sided vision. And what it meant was, and this was my experience as a scholar, that when I first started working on the Georgian Social Democratic, on the Georgian Democratic Republic, no one was interested. Nobody knew anything about it. They didn't want to know anything about it. From being the First Republic, from being anathema in the Soviet period, because the Soviet Union didn't want to acknowledge it either as a sort of as a viable political alternative. When we came to the 1990s, post Soviet Union, the same thing happened. It was again continued to be ignored and rejected as something that was vaguely associated with socialism, and therefore null and void, not worth thinking about. And that, generally, when we had the 100th anniversary in 2018 of the First Republic, I think things began to change. There's a group of young scholars in Georgia who are now doing a lot of fantastic work around the history of the First Republic. And if we start to read their books and articles, we might be able to restore some genuine analysis and understanding of the nature of the First Republic. So I think things are changing with the younger generation, and that's very good to see.
You mentioned that there was no interest in the First Republic at all, but I was always under the impression that when independence after the collapse of the Soviet Union happened, the only independent state to which this new government is looking towards inheriting, as an independent model is the First Republic. So there's things like the flag, there's things like the Constitution, which get, I believe, like reinstated in some ways. And so I'm kind of interested in your own opinion or your own perspective, your own experience of the ways in which there was pushback against that memory.
So the Georgian Constitution of the First Republic, which was passed in February of 1921, was briefly reinstalled, right, during let's say, that interregnum between Gamsakhudia and Shevardnadze. So that was more, I would say, symbolic politics. I don't think it had any relevance. I mean, Gamsakhudia, was a very right-wing politician. I find it quite extraordinary, actually, when I look at public opinion polls and such, and the heroization of Gamsakhudia that goes on. Saakashvili, of course, promoted that as well. But it's a general consensus, going back to Gamsakhudia as the savior, if you like. I mean, I think he was actually very destructive. But, the First Republic really never, I mean, beyond the flag and the brief sort of reinstatement of the Constitution, it was never, part of any analysis about lessons of the past, or the extraordinary thing about the First Republic. If you travel around Italy, right, you will see statues and monuments to Garibaldi, heroes, if you like, of the Italian movement of national unity. If you go to France, you see monuments even to Robespierre, for God's sake. And in Georgia, what do we have? I mean, we have a few plaques here and there, and I think maybe one or two roads are named after some members of the government of the First Republic. But there's no recognition, there's no public recognition of the First Republic, really. It's not incorporated at all into Georgian historiography, and also to, current politics, a recognition and an acknowledgement of really the very courageous, innovative, democratic steps that were taken during the period of 1918 to 21. And that, I think, is part of this fear, if you like, of socialism, which of course the Soviet Union sort of represented, and I think it poisoned people's minds against the First Republic, and anything that even liberalism. I mean, you have to ask the question as to why even liberalism seems to have largely failed in Georgia. I'm thinking about uh, the failure, for example, of the Republican Party to get any sort of established support in Georgian society, and of course its subsequent collapse. Um, there, there doesn't seem. I think that the Soviet legacy really has distorted Georgian politics. Uh, it's I think it's changing a little bit, but it's interesting that when you look at the alternatives that are provided by Georgian political parties, we just don't see really. We see it in civil society, but we don't see it in political parties. A sort of liberal alternative doesn't really exist.
We've been looking at archives, and one of them is Radio Freedom's manual for the editors
of the Georgian desk.
Yeah. And it's a right wing. I mean, so right wing. It's kind of mind boggling. And they have like instructions what to do, and they're like, make sure that you don't say the word colony, but make sure that the Georgians feel like they're a colony. And there was like a whole thing about the First Republic, and I laughed. I even took a picture. I can send it to you. It said, the rich people, nobles just gave land to the First Republic. This idea of expropriation, like the rich people didn't want nobles to give up land. Well, apparently it's only because of the Soviets they didn't want to give up land, but because it was like, Jordania, they were willing to give up all their land to socialism or whatever. Just like this ridiculous fairy tale that everyone was so happy with the socialists during the First Republic, and they were willing to give them land for it without any compensation or very little. So there was certain mythology, and they even say, I think, the word private property in there. It was a place where private property was respected. It's like the way they have envisioned it and tried to place these sort of libertarian or capitalist liberal values on the First Republic, and the way they have been explaining it since 1970s, because that was the Radio Freedom Liberty desk. Those manuals are from the 1970s, like 1976 or something like that. So, and they were constantly talking about how Georgians were oppressed and they need liberation and on and on and on. So for me, where I differ in this, like, I think of it, it's not just like a Soviet legacy. I don't think it's a Soviet legacy. I think this was very much created. There was so much effort put in to make sure the Soviet Union was seen as a particular way, day in, day out, to tell them that this is what's happening. And then no one in the Soviet Union, no one actually was, ideologically committed to anything. So like nobody was saying anything. It was just really like Radio Freedom and Voice of America and so on. And then afterwards, it was also the same kind of talking points forever ad infinitum. Today, you can't say a word about, Soviet Union or socialism without being attacked in a really vicious way. And so I think most people never had even time to think about the Soviet Union at all. They were never given a chance because they have never been asked. It's going from one extreme to another for them. And so like when... So I guess what I'm saying is I feel like it was manufactured a lot of ways, how to feel about the Soviet Union. And that's in some way why our project exists. It's like, I don't think this is how people feel about the Soviet Union. Sure, there's maybe some nostalgia in there, but so is the people who hate Soviet Union, entirely. That's also part of their manufactured ideas as well, how to feel about it. So it's not like there's an objective way. Of course, we're trying to get closer to the truth by trying to, find more and more things to support it.
So Sopo, I've always found myself in a difficult position on the left when I was in the UK and to some extent here in the US, because I've always taken the position that the Soviet Union was a betrayal of socialism. So, very often I'm sure I sounded like a right-wing ideologue when I was talking about the Soviet Union and the way that, in fact, it had um, distorted what people on the left had wanted to see, right? Um, I, for example, consider self-determination and um, democratic self-government, governance, very much part of what I would consider to be a socialist view, right? And of course, none of that existed in the Soviet Union. And that's not to say that the Soviet Union didn't have some positive parts to it, but I think I spent a lot of time there, and I talked about the sort of fantastic fin de siècle that existed at that time in the late 70s. But still, everybody was fearful. It was a system in which you could not talk freely. It was a system too in which even let's talk about the workers, right? Um, it wasn't as if they could manage their own lives at the workplace in the factories. They couldn't. The whole system was controlled. It was a very corrupt system. So, even if you could lead a decent life, um, it was a very hierarchical system. I talked about this at the beginning. Very privileged system for certain groups. Um, uh, so it wasn't. It wasn't. I mean, it was clearly inferior to the ideas and principles of the First Republic, and even to the practice of the First Republic, which sustained a level of democratic activity that was abandoned in the Soviet state. Now, people sometimes they might say, well, here you are, middle class guy talking about the privileges of democracy and so on. But I do think it's absolutely central if we want to retain the credibility of left wing politics, then democracy to me is central to it. Self government is central to it. Um, and I think that, the Soviet Union in many ways destroyed the credibility of socialism. I think that uh, you know, why was it that after the collapse of the Soviet Union, left-wing parties and European communist parties, they just all lost their support and credibility. They went down with the ship. Um, so I think we have to get back to some of the very interesting discussion and debates that were going on in Europe um, in the late 19th, early 20th centuries about the relationship, between nationalism and socialism and how they can be combined, self-determination, self-government. I mean, these were all big, honest debates that were going on in the Second International, and also to some extent, among European left-wing parties, the Communist Party in Italy, for example, in Spain. It was a movement was called Euro-communism. I don't know whether you probably don't remember it, but the idea being that everybody goes their own way. Everybody has their own sovereignty, their own values, their own ideas. And this is true, surely, of socialism, that it's not. Yes, it is. It has shares some universal ideas and principles, but they have to be interpreted in different ways according to where you are and the context. Um, when you think about, even when you think about communism, there's no, as far as I'm concerned, when I look at the way that communism was practiced, um, there's no universal model. Every communist model was a national model at some level. Even among the satellite states of the Soviet Union, like Poland or Hungary, to whatever extent they could, they infused their ideas of communism with national ideas as well. So I understand that there's this nostalgia for among certain people. We know, for example, that um, according to opinion polling in Georgia, maybe somewhere between 25 and 30% of Georgians still have some nostalgia for the Soviet period. I think that's largely generated by the post-Soviet period and the real economic and social problems that occurred and continue to exist in Georgia that sort of led people to think, oh, it was so much better in the Soviet period. Um, but to be honest with you,
For them,
huh?
it was better objectively. In the Soviet period,
Well,
their lives
yeah,
were
yeah,
better.
yes,
90%, I would say,
yeah,
including workers, everyone, because they still have the fear. Their life still being managed by someone else, but they at least had like food and like ability to travel and like free education, which now and home, which they don't have anymore. So I think like if we compare it to a better future, sure. I mean, it's better future is much better, but there's only post-communist world of 30 years of complete, degradation, or there's a time where they remembered stability and like food and culture,
right,
like because theaters were open and those things were free, and now they don't even have them. All the cinemas have been
yeah,
converted into totalitazor, like gambling places.
betting shops.
Yeah,
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. The capitalism cannot provide either, and in particular, the post-Soviet form of capitalism, which is pretty wild. Um, but at the same time, having experienced the Soviet Union and studied the Soviet Union, I don't think we should ignore the fact that um, it wasn't just about suppression of the intelligentsia. It was also a failed system in terms of giving people the right to make decisions about their own lives. That was never granted. Yeah, there were certain uh, sort of basic principles in place, like free education, which was important, medical care, and so on. Absolutely, these were very positive things. But I think you have to put it in the context of a system that was uh, um, arbitrary in many ways. And, decisions could be made about your life, whoever you were, whether you were a worker or a peasant or an intelligentsia representative, you know, you had no control over your life, ultimately, in the Soviet system. That's
I
not
honestly
the
think
sort.
most people would agree that they don't have control now. I mean, I understand what you're saying,
Yeah,
but I just think
right.
like most people would feel like they have
Yeah,
control
I
over their
mean,
lives at all.
right.
I mean, all the elections are rigged here.
Yes, no,
No one
I'm
knows
not denying
anything.
that. Yeah, I'm not denying that. Um, and that would be a whole other analysis and critique, and I would be very much, you know, interested in talking about that because I think you're right. I think we have rather idealized view of the post-Soviet period as a period of liberation, but I would
Yeah, that's
not.
all you hear.
Yeah, at the same time, the Soviet Union was not the model that we could sort of contrast in black and white terms with the post-Soviet period. There were really some very negative parts also to the Soviet system for ordinary people too. So, for example, if you take
Sorry, but the nostalgia have to mean accepting the entire system? Like, does that mean that though?
well, look, take an issue like housing, right? So, you talk about free housing and so on, very low rents. Yes, absolutely, very important. But it was a very corrupt system in terms of the way that housing was distributed and controlled. Um, in terms of the way that privileges were granted if you were a member of the Communist Party. If you were a worker in the Communist Party, you could travel more freely. You could watch certain movies that your fellow workers probably could not. You could go to special shops and get goods that your fellow workers could not. It wasn't. It's still a system that has to be condemned for what it represented, I believe. And I'm saying that from a position of a socialist, of a social democrat.
One of the main focuses of the project is, memory politics. Something that I think has become sort of like a recurring theme. One of the reasons we wanted to interview you, one of the reasons we're interviewing a lot of historians, is because of the role that memory politics in Georgia has played in the development of the form of capitalism that we've been discussing here. And so maybe I would ask, or I would say, is like, it seems like the Soviet Union, just like the First Republic, just like capitalism, have all become caricatures. And because there's no sort of real common understanding of what the Soviet system was, what the First Republic was, they sort of become stand-ins, instrumentalized tools in service of other things. So I guess when we talk about we look at the way in which the Soviet past and Soviet history, for example, in Georgia, is being investigated not on its own terms or its own merit, but in service of other things. For example, through nonprofit organizations that are receiving, funds for particular political ends, and they're the ones who are funding research about, say, the Soviet period, but the only types of research projects they're doing are about repression. So then you lose all of this nuance that we're having in this conversation about what the Soviet past in Georgia was. So what I'm curious about is, and I think that even if there are plenty of critiques worth levying against the Soviet Union, the question would be that in Georgia, is it possible to have a nuanced conversation about the Soviet Union when the mainstream discourse and the mainstream conversation has been reduced to no nuance? So now you know what I mean? So one of the reasons we're doing Reimagining Soviet Georgia is seems to be this huge dissonance. All of these people who lived through the Soviet Union and lived through the 90s having such horrible post-Soviet experience, plus a seemingly kind of like negatively idealized version of the Soviet Union that only sees it in terms of occupation and repression. And so then the question, I think that the task for like what we're trying to do is, how do we fill in the gaps? How do we try to actually pay service or pay tribute to the kind of nuanced, everyday lived experiences? And what does that negative experience of people in the 90s and the fact that it was so much worse, right? That's objectively true, so much worse from the late Soviet period, the 70s and the 80s into the 90s. What does that tell us about the USSR when the only thing in the common Georgian discourse today is about how it was like a repressive apparatus? Because I think that actually, if you approach the Soviet Union, like you're saying, with a full understanding of the picture, then I think you can actually levy these critiques. Then you can say, well, of course, there were these problems. But when you don't even have the full picture, how are you supposed to? You get what I'm saying?
I mean, if everyone thought it true, we would be in a great position.
Right. No, I agree with you entirely. I think that there are two things there that you mentioned that sort of hit the mark. I think, firstly is memory politics. It's, memory is an instrument of power, right? It's how you shape the past that determines the present. I mean, I'm not the first person to say that, right? And certainly in Georgia, the manipulation of history has always been the case. It continues to be the case, and it's for purposes. Why do you manipulate history? To justify what you're doing in the present. In most cases, right? That's why we talk about memory as a source of power, how you shape it. So that's very true. And the second part of it is, as you say, no discussion of the Soviet period. It's almost a blank page. Nobody wants to talk about it. I mean, part of this is, no discussion, in fact, of what went on in the 1930s, the whole period of the purges and such. And I mean, that discussion of that and an understanding of that is a liberation in itself, and there's really been no discussion of it. But also, how ordinary people lived their lives in the Soviet period, and one of the ways we can get at that, I think, is oral history. It's a very important part of understanding, the way that people experienced the Soviet Union, and it might open, it certainly will increase our understanding of how ordinary people, let's say, experience this, and what their thoughts about their lives were at the time. Unfortunately, we've missed so much of that because so many people from that period have died. But that's what we should be doing now. We should be recording people who lived in these times, and that would be perhaps the best way to open these doors and windows to better understanding of the Soviet period, as your project is directed at, right? Because I think right now Georgian historians and historiography is just not up to it, except in the younger generation maybe, but no one. It's not a very nice thing to say, but Georgian historical exploration of this period is, if it does take place very often, it's totally inadequate. Partly because of this sort of general, very negative view of the Soviet period, right? So there's nothing that people don't go into it with an open mind. So yeah, I mean, I would agree with that, and I'm hoping that some of the younger generation in Georgia are open to. I mean, I think the people active like Irakli Khadagiani and others in Sovlab are definitely exploring those issues through oral history projects, and I'm glad that you are too. I think this is one way to go.
As Sopa said, we've been going to the archives. We've been spending time at the manuscript archive, and in Sabartalo, and there is a collection, both the Radio Freedom collection, but also a collection that's being processed by a Cold War era Georgian emigre, Ivan Nanuashvili, who's a very kind of like, he's an interesting character, but he was in the fought against the Sovietization of Georgia, became a general in the Polish army, and then went to the United States. And he was sort of part of this anti-communist emigre world in the United States in the Cold War. But what's interesting is that and he's one of the few Georgians who's in, kind of with some of these larger sort of emigre anti-communist networks. But what's interesting about his writing, and he's writing in Georgian and English and Polish and Russian, but his writings are always trying to frame, because he's a military person, the future of Georgia as being only seen in kind of a military geopolitical context, but from the right, him saying that it must be a protectorate of the West in order to sort of like undo the continuities between the Russian imperial period into the Sovietization, which are just one long Russian imperial story in the country. And so what's interesting about that is that it seems like in some of the ways that the anti-Soviet, anti-communist narratives of the post-Soviet period took hold in a geopolitical sense in Georgia, that there was actually a narrative before that in the Soviet period of people who weren't in the USSR, who were already trying to kind of frame it as, say, like, Georgia can only exist, and this is maybe the point I'm trying to get at, that Georgia's sovereignty can only exist if it's protected by the West. And to me, this has always been a really interesting sort of contradiction of Georgian sovereignty, Georgian discourses about independence, is that, is it actually possible, given Georgia's size, given its placement, to think about its own independence in a way that doesn't just feed into this narrative of Western reliance, and to me, it's been kind of like shocking, I guess, like how there's a stream of hardcore kind of nationalism that maybe throws around the language of sovereignty, but at the end of the day reproduces it. So, for example, even some of the and maybe this goes back to the First Republic, and I wanted to bring this up earlier, but it's like, the First Republic, even in a geopolitical sense, like its reliance on Western patronage to even exist, if it's seen in tension with Bolshevization or the Soviet Union. And so, I don't know. I don't really have one concrete.
Sort of exactly how Russia says, or Soviet Union, or Stalin said, is that Georgia will always be used upon by the West to undermine us.
Right.
So in a way, they're both reinforcing it.
Right. That was exactly the point I was going to get to. Is that it seems like the Russian, sort of like maybe you could say the Russian chauvinist narrative today would say that Georgia can only imagine itself as being a sort of pawn of NATO, pawn of the West. But then you actually have this what it seems to me would be a wing or a narrative of Georgian nationalism that reinforces this narrative by saying that you're right, it's true, we must have Western patronage.
I think that generally there has been this emphasis, certainly since independence for Georgia after 1991, of reliance on the West, obviously, as patrons and support for Georgian security, and there's been you can understand why, but there is this sort of security approach towards Georgian sovereignty, and I feel that Georgia, even if it has a 30,000 person army, obviously is not going to be able to protect its security from Russia. So it's not a military question for Georgia. I mean, obviously they have to have a military for certain purposes. What really is important about Georgian sovereignty is, of course, a democratic state in which is fully legitimate and in which popular participation is front and center, so that there is no so that in other words, to take a phrase, the fortress is strong within. You don't need those external barriers so much when you have a functioning democratic popular government in which the citizens feel they are citizens. That's the greatest source of sovereignty. That's the greatest source of strength for any country. Georgia doesn't have that yet, I don't think. There's still this problem of a government that seems completely out of touch with the needs of its citizens.
Zogio mis karish khamchi